if we start with stress, which is a really kind of fundamental thing for us as these like living organisms that are trying to survive. And so there's different kind of ways of coping with stress, right? And some of them seem to be kind of linked to the serotonin system.
Absolutely, yeah. So in a paper that Dr. Carhart-Harris wrote before me, it's called A Tale of Two Receptors, and he says, there's two stress systems. One's mediated by the serotonin 1A receptor, and that promotes kind of a patient waiting or enduring of stress, and kind of what we might associate with the learned helplessness of depression. You're kind of just waiting through stress. And then this other serotonin receptor, the one we're talking about, the serotonin 2A receptor, promotes behavioral activation actually in response to stress. And Dr. Carhart-Harris in that piece suggests there's a switch towards more 2A receptor signaling under conditions of chronic or intense stress, which is an effort to promote radical adaptation when other responses to stress aren't working, right? So it's not necessarily evolutionarily worth it for an organism to try and radically adapt its behavior or its way of perceiving the world if it's already working, right? Why would you change what's not broken? But if the behavior is not adequate, then it might be worth risking something like a psychosis or some kind of maladaptation in order to promote in the off chance that you get a functional adaptation. So
yeah, I think this came to mind when you were describing higher incidence of psychosis in communities that face kind of oppression, because I do think we all construct beliefs around the world to kind of keep ourselves safe and regulate our emotional lives. And delusional thinking to me does seem to, the idea that it is mediated through stress makes a lot of sense to me, that like you're feeling unsafe and you need to hold on to your beliefs incredibly tightly because that makes you feel better, makes you feel safer. And that could, if things are stressful enough, that could be pathological. It might not be beneficial in the long term, but it could actually be helpful, right? If you really think you know what's going on, that can be, I guess, a kind of self-soothing process.
Yes, it could be. And if you look at maybe like not full-blown delusions that most people consider pathological, but just us versus them thinking. So in terms of delusions, your two most common types in psychosis there's probably three very common types, which would be self-referential delusions, in which you think everything relates to yourself. Everything's a sign and message to yourself. Grandiose delusions, where you might have a sense of significance or purpose, and then persecutory delusions, where you think people are against you. And just those three features, if you have just thinking that's slightly delusional, you can develop strong us versus them mentalities that actually promote activism or like social engagement or kind of group bonding and yeah. So you can see how I don't think anyone's arguing that psychosis is functional in any way, but the reason it persists probably evolutionarily is psychotic like thinking in lesser degrees can be functional, especially under conditions of stress and persecution, where maybe it's better to take a kind of hard line approach and kind of simplify reality so you can act in reality.
Yeah, actually, the other week happened to be thinking about a similar idea of a kind of spectrum from, if you think of kind of meditative spiritual experience, where often there's a feeling of kind of realizing you don't really know anything, kind of letting go of all your concepts, seeing through them and thinking and kind of confronting a real kind of a mysteriousness to existence and being okay with that, feeling positive with that. That's a state of really letting go of all of your beliefs. And at the other extreme, you might have something like, I guess in extreme fascism or something, where you see these political ideologies often go along with invented narratives, just scapegoating narratives of people where they've just made something up kind of demonstrably, but people believe it. And it probably is serving some kind of, some process of making people feel better because they've managed to come up with some narrative that suits them, rather than having to sit with whatever the ambient stress might be.
Absolutely. And I think, and this is kind of related to the piece that I'm working on now, but it seems counterintuitive that you might have kind of extreme openness and like cognitive flexibility, like in your meditative state, where there's no judgments really, or less judgments, and not a lot of ideological fixation, but how that actually might be related to subsequent ideological fixations. So if you look at something like even something like the counterculture in the 60s and early 70s, you have kind of this weird mixture of people who are just anything goes, values open to all types of things, with kind of entrenched ideology as well, and these things mix. And there's some psychological models of radicalization where you can get an opening up of the mind, an opening up of possibilities, and then a subsequent kind of contraction and fixation around a newfound identity, because loosening beliefs provides grounds for forming alternative fixed beliefs. And you might actually, I've been reading and toying with the idea where the psychedelic state, and dream states for that matter, by creating kind of the free association of information, it allows for generalizations across contexts, kind of associating information across contexts to form generalizations, which then can lead to a simpler schemas of the world, but can kind of create these ideological fixations where you can assemble information into these ideological frameworks. I don't think those, it seems like they might be unrelated, but they actually might fit nicely together in some contexts. And I think you're interested in Buddhism and contemplative traditions. And I think in those traditions, there's a real emphasis on trying to maintain the plastic state, right? Not, if you're opening the mind up, not to subsequently fall into the ideological fixations that are actually a danger when you're opening the mind up like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, I really advocate for a combination, I guess, of staying in touch with that open kind of meditative state, combined with actively working on one's emotional health to reduce stress levels, so you don't need to hold on to stories as tightly. And I think if you don't do those two things in an ongoing way, and instead say you have a big psychedelic experience, during that experience you may feel enlightened, and you may be letting go of all your stories and maybe very positive, but then you come back and you see it again and again. It's very easy for someone to, I guess it's almost like a rebound where they need to have a story about it, and where it's like, okay, the universe is like this, or reality is like this, and that's my story now, and I'm sticking to it. I think that's I can quite easily imagine the brain kind of needing to, or naturally overcompensating for, it's a moment of loss of control, and it's like, okay, we really need to double down on the control as a kind of compensatory reflex.
Absolutely. And I even wonder whether it's not a feature of the classic psychedelic experience. And maybe it would be worth comparing the classic psychedelic experience to the types of kind of mystical type experiences that might be induced by ketamine or something. Because in the classic psychedelic experience, it seems like there's often this opening up and kind of freedom at some point in the experience. And then at some point, an insight might come along, and there's, or towards the end of experience, there's a fixation on a certain idea that came about, and that fixation then carries through and fascinates the person. And then there's the interpretation of the experience afterwards. And who knows what that might be related to, enduring dopaminergic signaling that kind of, re-ingrains, it kind of helps re-ingrain ideas about the experience, or
Right.
But it almost seems to be a feature of the experience itself.